All right, let me see if I can figure out how to do this Facebook thing. Because even though we are now live on YouTube, the Facebook streams somewhere else. So I need to see if I can share this video. Share. Wait, one share. Share it to... I don't know how to do this, so Facebook is going to have to deal with it later. We'll figure it out. All right, but anyways, hello everybody, and welcome to our June listening club. A little bit of housekeeping before we dive into the Beatles here. This is one of 3 multimedia clubs that we have here at the Dragonfly Arts Collective. We do this music club monthly, and we also have a monthly movie club where we are watching 1917. However, I don't believe there's going to be a meeting this month. We just haven't had the time for it, but I still think you should watch the movie because it's phenomenal. We also have a quarterly book club that will be meeting at the end of next month, and we're reading Werner Herzog's most recent memoir. So you should join us for those, and you can always join us at our Facebook group, which I've put on the screen, the Dragonfly Arts. So Dragonfly Arts and Creatives Collective is the full name of it. We don't just do the multimedia clubs. We also have weekly meetings. We do a feedback meeting on Monday nights. I was just there. We saw some really cool stuff there. We also do weekly creative calls where we discuss creative problems. We have live meetups. We have a lot of other things in the works, including our Patreon, which is up, but currently does not have any sort of perks that come with giving us money on there. Specifically, everything we do is open to the public, so this is just a way for you to support the things that we do. You can go there and support us for as little as $2 a month. We are working on getting some perks up. Life's been crazy. Life gets in the way of everything. But without further ado, this month we listened to Abbey Road by the Beatles, which I am joined by 2 experts on the matter. So
I only see one, but okay, sure.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, not me. I can talk a lot about it. I'm not an expert.
No, then we have no experts because I thought you were the expert.
There you go.
This is like such an intense thing. I think I made the joke when I made the pick, but when I was in college, there was essentially an entire minor that was just the music of the Beatles.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, you could minor in the Beatles when I was in music school, and I took 0 classes on them.
I think you can minor in Taylor Swift now.
I think still the Beatles has a minor on it, but I don't know what the classes are like now.
There you go.
It was just always really funny to me. And I feel like I don't need to ask the question, but I am going to ask the question of, have you guys listened to this album before? And did you re-listen to it before joining the club tonight?
Yes and yes.
What album?
Oh,
Abbey Road. Yes, and yes.
I actually spent my entire weekend listening to all of the albums.
You mean, wait, all of the Beatle albums?
Yeah.
Holy cats.
That'll give you some great insight.
There you go.
Yeah, I had to like put them on there. Okay, I didn't actually listen to Yellow Submarine. I skipped over it because I was running out of time. But I started on like Saturday morning and just like listened to it throughout the day.
Did you do it chronologically?
Yes, I did.
Oh, that's good. That's a good way to do it.
It's something that's weirdly been on my to-do list for a very long time because I am by no means like I don't know anything about the Beatles. I was never like really introduced to them until much later in my life. Then I think it was just kind of like one of those things that was so popular but was never like just always existed. And so I never really did a deep dive and I was like, you know what? Let's do this. But I think the first question I wanted to ask is what's your favorite song that you listen to on this?
Can you answer the medley?
I also was going to answer the medley. So,
Yeah, that's,
yes.
and so a couple of things about the medley. I always thought it started with you never give me your money, but it really doesn't start till Me and Mr. Mustard. Isn't that right?
Technically, the medley is like considered the entire side too. Like
Hmm.
in like a
Mm.
like whenever I was like looking into it, but I think it actually starts with "You never give me your money." I think that's where they decide that it goes.
Would
Let me actually double check.
Yeah, well, it's neither here nor there, but I always thought it started with that when I listened to the LP as a kid, and that was kind of always my favorite part. But then "You Never Give Me Your Money" is a full-blown song. I mean, the whole reason they did the medley was because they didn't have enough finished songs. They had these what they called song fragments, unfinished songs. And then Paul just decided to get together with George Martin and knit them into something, which I
Y-
think he did quite well. I
So, "You Never Give Me Your Money" is considered the start of it, but I think it's interesting that it's weird to have like a McCartney song and then into like a Lennon song and then have it drift back into. So I think, yeah,
well,
it
the
does feel
reason
like it starts with Mean Mr. Mustard. I would agree with that.
well, and the only reason I say that is like I always thought it started with "You Never Give Me Your Money," but there's no transition, or what do you call it? There's no segue between "You Give Me Your Money" and Sun King and "Me, Mr. Mustard." The songs like end, which means they're technically not transitions, and so everything from Mean Mr. Mustard on is a transition, has a transition from one song to the next, right? But I mean, I could be wrong. I always thought "You Never Give Me Your Money" was the beginning. So that's my favorite. Sorry, that was a really long answer. Tim, before I suck all the oxygen out of the room, let's let Tim answer.
That's all right. You know, um, I've always had a soft spot, even before I started listening with keen ears to the Beatles. I always had a soft spot for Maxwell Silverhammer
Bang,
um,
bang.
because I love the irony. Um, and I think even before I heard that, I had heard the stuff that Freddie Mercury and Queen were doing with British Music Hall, and I liked that, and I think that's the thing that I heard first in Maxwell Silverhammer. And there's that great irony between the lyric and the sound of the music, and yeah. But I also love I love something. I think it's one of the best things that Harrison wrote. But I have to say, this album wears me out. It's like once we get done with "Here Comes the Sun," I'm finished. I don't. And I'm not sure. I've been thinking a lot about why that is, and I don't. It doesn't feel to me like this is a very cohesive band album. Um, and we know in retrospect that it really wasn't much of a band album, but and with that in mind, I went back and listened to "Let It Be," and that gels as an album. Every song, I think, if you take any of those songs out, you lose something with that album. It's just I think it's a masterpiece. Where I think this is a bunch of very scattered stuff, and I don't care for the medley. I think I think you end this album with "Here Comes the Sun," and then you create another album with everything that comes after "Here Comes the Sun," and then you got two decent albums. But yeah, I just stylistically it bounces around so much. Um, it's a very weird album for me. it's not that there's anything that's bad. It's just, stuff like Carry That Weight and, well, especially Carry That Weight. That should be a song on its own. They should have taken that and said, let's do something with this and let's turn this into a 4-minute song.
Yeah, or Golden Slumbers. And I think the reason
Yeah,
that didn't
Golden
happen
Slumbers
is,
too.
yeah, the reason that didn't happen is they didn't have a working relationship, whereas before Sergeant Pepper, Paul and
Yeah.
John didn't have a song finished. They'd work on it together and the other guy would help him
Yeah.
finish it. And that wasn't going to happen on this album, as far as I
Yeah.
can.
It just, if I didn't know, I mean, obviously we know the background of what's actually going on during the Get Back sessions. We don't know as much. We don't have an as you are there kind of picture of what was going on here. But even without knowing that, it feels to me like everybody's just talking to everybody on the phone and, hey, listen to this and yeah, we'll put something together. But it never feels, with the sole exception maybe of Come Together. Come Together feels like a Beatles tune that everybody, the whole band was involved with. But the rest of it, Maybe I Want You. George Harrison songs always feel like George Harrison songs. As a songwriter, he sticks out like a sore thumb in a very good way. Whereas with the Lennon-McCartney songs, it always, prior to this album, it always feels to me like the band is performing these songs. But by the time you get to this, it's like, yeah, everybody's just doing their own material and they throw it on the tape and be done with it.
That had been going on for a while since the White Album. But yeah, Tim, did you listen to this growing up when you were younger?
I heard it growing up. I can't say that I listened to it. I was listening to, they were too pop for me when I was growing up. I was listening, that old thing about you're either Beatles or Stones. Well, I was Stones. The Beatles were too pop for me. And I was starting to get into metal, and the Beatles were like way far away from that. It wasn't until maybe 15 years ago that I started listening attentively to the Beatles, because I was ready to hear that kind of songcraft. My ears were better prepared to understand. I understood pop better 15 years ago than I did when I was a kid.
Yeah. You had more of a mindset for it?
Oh, say that again, Rebecca?
I said you had more of a mindset for it. You could look at it more.
I knew a lot more about music, and I knew a lot more about pop craft. The closest I really got to pop, well, Top 40 was very different when Miguel and I were growing up. But, what I recognized as good, solid pop when I was growing up was the Fleetwood Mac stuff. Those 3 Fleetwood Mac albums, the White Album, Rumors, and Tusk. But other than that, I didn't hear a lot going on in pop that I really, on an album level, that I could enjoy. I was listening, at the beginning of that decade, I was listening to mostly black music, mostly funk and R&B. And at the tail end, I started listening to hard rock. So the pop stuff didn't get me. The Beatles just went right over my head back then.
Hi, Beckett.
Hi.
We were just talking about what our favorite song from the album was.
Oh, perfect.
It's your turn.
I said Maxwell's Silver Hammer.
Really?
Just to be contrarian.
Interesting choice. I don't know. That's a hard question. I mean, back in the day, I would have probably said because but now I'm not so sure. I love Come Together.
It's my number 2.
I think my favorite part of this album is actually, the more I think about it, the more, and especially after the discussion we just had, because I also do feel like this is a disjointed album, especially after listening to them all in a row. It's like watching the band slowly dissemble itself. So my favorite part of this album is actually just the transitions between Oh Darling to Octopus's Garden to I Want You. Just listening to those all 3 in a row was just hilarious to me.
Yeah, Octopus's Garden definitely feels like it doesn't belong on this album at all.
It feels like every joke about Ringo Just like because he has a song on every album, and like I feel like most of the time you're like, okay, this is like it feels like it fits, but it's just like so jarring in this one that it's like, all right, and this is Ringo's song.
I mean, I've always loved "Here Comes the Sun." I actually put together a tribute, like a video tribute to George Harrison when he died when I was in AV Club in high school, set to that song. So,
Hey, did you know that that's their most streamed song and by a lot for whatever reason? I was wondering if it was on a soundtrack or something, but I was kind of surprised by that.
it's
By
a
Here
great
Comes the
song.
Sun, or
Here Comes the Sun is their most streamed song, and it's like by millions, like not by a
yeah,
little bit.
it-
At least
it-
the last I
it's-
checked. I can't tell you when I last checked.
It's definitely been used on a lot of things and been in a lot of movies and a lot of commercials. I hear it all the time in commercials.
And it's been covered a lot
Yeah.
too.
There you go. Well, so about the, sort of the band breaking up. So I have a hypothesis because that's what I do. And I think this album is like, I grew up with this album, so I have an emotional attachment to the album since I was a kid, right? So that's a bias. But it's like a great recording, but it's not great songs, right? It's like if you look at just the John and Paul stuff, there's no top 5 John Lennon, Paul McCartney songs on it like there is on Let It Be or Sgt. Pepper or Revolver or Rubber Soul. You know what I mean? So like all the songwriting, it's not really strong songwriting except for George, where there's 2 top 5 George songs on this album. By the way, Frank Sinatra covered something. And so I just thought that's just friggin' amazing that somebody like Frank Sinatra can cover a Beatles song. And then the hilarious thing is he took the time to attribute the songwriters and he got it wrong. He said it was a Lennon McCartney song. Anyway, but I think, and that like even the best John song on here, Come Together, he got sued for plagiarism, and the settlement was one of his solo albums called Rock and Roll. And it's actually a really cool settlement. So he stole the first 2 lines of the lyrics from a Chuck Berry song. Chuck Berry didn't own his publishing, so the publisher sued John, and the settlement was you have to do an album of covers of only stuff that we publish. So it's like old rock and roll stuff. And but that's John's best song, and then he like got sued for plagiarism. It's sort of like wasn't super creative starting off by lifting 2 lines from Chuck Berry.
I thought
But
he also wrote it as part of like a political campaign for somebody, and then they had to rework it into an actual song.
Oh, there you go. I didn't know that. But anyway, it's just like and then the whole medley, I think I mentioned already that the whole medley was just done out of desperation because I had all these unfinished songs. They didn't have enough material to finish the album. And then it became my thing. And Becca, you missed this, but it's Rebecca and I's favorite quote unquote song is the medley, right? And it's just kind of a mess from a songwriting standpoint. And you can kind of tell people are holding back stuff for their solo albums already. I don't think George was, but George was limited to no more than 2 songs on every Beatles album. So he was sort of de facto holding stuff back for his solo albums without wanting to. But it's just interesting that so the hypothesis is this is a great recording, not a great set of songs, because I do think it's recorded really well. And in terms of their recording skills and chops and all that stuff, they're at the peak of their powers as a band, obviously, because they're at the end, right? But the recording is really, I think it's just a great, great recording. And lots of people who worked on this album and other albums had huge careers afterwards, with this as a jumping off point, Alan Parsons and all those guys, Jeff Emmerich. Anyway, that was my hypothesis. Not the greatest songs.
But it
Was
has
this
synth
the-
in it, so
Was this the last album they did together as a group?
It's the last thing they recorded, but it was released before Let It Be for whatever reason. So their last moments as a band are on this album.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Weird stuff.
You know,
Mike,
I was talking about how this album wears me out, and how, you know, you get to Here Comes the Sun and I'm done. And I was looking at, then I said about how Let It Be is like a perfect album. Abbey Road is like 13 minutes longer than Let It Be. And it's got, I think Let It Be has 11 songs, and there's 16 tracks on Abbey Road. And, you know, speaking of George Harrison, his songs always have stood out. It's almost like he doesn't belong in this band. He should have been a solo artist from the beginning, because then that's not to say there's not this great level of craft with Lennon McCartney. It's just that Harrison is a completely different kind of songwriter. And it just, when his tracks pop up on a Beatles album, for me, it's like a resting point where I can just sit back and I can listen to the song and just be surrounded by the tune and not have to really pay attention to what's going on. I admire him such a great deal as a craftsman.
You know what else is going on with George is obviously he was held back because he's competing with Lennon and McCartney to get on a Beatles album in the first place. It took him a few albums to even do that. And so he's developing as a songwriter, you know, more and more and more. And I think he reaches his peak around the White Album with While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But then if you think of his guitar style, he's known for this amazing slide guitar style and doing slide guitar and harmonies with each other. And he did none of that with the Beatles. He didn't develop that until his first solo album. So it's like he's the one Beatle that had major, growth as an artist after the Beatles. I mean, as great as Paul and John's solo stuff was, you know, there's just this major growth with George, and it kind of, and maybe it was always there, but the rest of the guys wouldn't let him put it on a Beatles album. But yeah,
That's my sense. That's my sense, that it was always there, and he just couldn't get any play on his material.
And there was a lot of headbutting between him and Paul, and he really felt that Paul denigrated his guitar playing and really, gave him less confidence, just because Paul was the taskmaster. If it wasn't for Paul, there would be 6 Beatles albums instead of all of these, right? The other guys were interested in working that hard.
After I was reading about Let It Be, and I hadn't realized this, but George recorded like multiple guitar solos for that tune. And so I went back and listened to all of them, and the one that George Martin chose for the single was kind of the weakest one, but the one that's on the album, at least the album that I listened to, just rips. It sounds like the perfect solo for Let It Be. Yeah, I think George had all that stuff. They just weren't letting him, put it on the album.
Or where he had to fight to get it on the album, but yeah.
I was going to ask, after we did the favorite songs, what your favorite Beatle album is.
Oh, the White Album, absolutely. But again, that's an emotional thing. I love it that it's a mess, and it's a beautiful mess, and it sounds like 4 guys in a room a lot of the time, but working stuff out, as opposed to Abbey Road is pretty polished. And if you're a starting drummer, you're just like, whoa. But there's stuff you can listen to on the White Album. You go, well, I can do that. Jesus, that's just 4 guys in a room. In fact, there's 2 tracks on the White Album that they literally recorded in a closet at Abbey Road just to make it sound like a chess recording. Anyway, but that's my favorite.
Tim?
For the longest time, it was the White Album, but over the last 6 or 7 years, it's become Let It Be. I think Let It Be is a perfect album. And I love both the original release and the naked version as well. Although I prefer the programming on the original release.
The programming is different on naked?
Yeah. Yeah,
Really?
I think Paul turned a couple of songs around.
Oh.
And once you get used to hearing albums like these in that order, those songs in that order, you like it throws you off when you listen to one, or you listen.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. Yeah, I had
it's
misremembered this album order. I was like blown away that Something Came After Come Together. I was like, I don't remember that at all. But yeah.
yeah. But speaking about While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that's probably my all-time favorite Beatles tune.
Oh, Tim, you got to check out the Rick Rubin series of interviews with Paul. They go into the tracks and they're soloing stuff on that tune. And, Rick's pointing things out that Paul never considered. And it's just the way they deconstruct that tune by isolating the bass and isolating other stuff is really cool. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Becca, what's your favorite Beatles album?
I was just trying to decide. That's a tough question. I'm trying to think which one, when I was like listening to the Beatles all the time, which one did I pop in the most? It's probably between, oh gosh, I don't know.
You don't have to pick. I usually am like in the
hard
moment,
one.
like whenever I ask what somebody's favorite thing is, I always assume that I'm asking like in that moment because everything changes regularly. Like you don't have to pick one
And it's
thing.
also a matter of like, there are certain songs that I love on every album. Like it's not a matter of like an album as a whole. It's just individual songs that stick out to me.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I would put that one on to hear that song. I don't know. I like the White Album. Is it my favorite though? Come back to me.
For the hipsters, you just got to pick one of the R albums, Rubber Soul or Revolver. That's what the hipsters go for.
I love both of them.
It's interesting how the White Album, in terms of craft and sound, seems to sit right in the middle. Would you agree with that, Miguel? It seems like they're at the peak of the mountain, and then it's kind of, I think Let It Be is a fantastic album, but like you said, it sounds like they're still kind of working together on the White Album.
Ooh. Yeah, they kind of, I think they sounded like they were working together. I think functionally they stopped working together at Sgt. Pepper's. Because the White Album is the album Ringo quit on, right? George quit during Let It Be and Ringo quit during the White Album. So all was not well. This is the first Beatles album I got. We had a live-in babysitter, and then she vanished and left me all of her LPs because she just vanished. And this was there, and that was and I was 12. And I wore that thing out, and I loved that it was just freaky. There's like heavy metal on it, and then music hall, and then what the hell do you do with Number 9, right? So, but that's just an emotional 12-year-old person discovering a great artist stuff. But yeah, it's got a little more cohesion and feels like there's more quote unquote band moments than later, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I still can't get over the fact that Yellow Submarine came after White Album.
It's very odd, isn't it?
Musical Mystery Tour together as like, these are albums you can skip. But it's because even on those, to what Beckett said, even on both of those, there's some really great stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love some of my favorite songs. Like, I don't know, it's so nostalgic for me to think about. There was when I was like going through my elongated Beatles phase, I got on a kick of watching all the Beatles movies multiple times. And there's something about Yellow Submarine. Like listening to those songs makes me think of that movie. And it's very nostalgic to me.
There you go. That's awesome. But there's, that album has got really good tracks on it. There's I'm always blown away. That was one of the real gifts of writing the book is I really hadn't listened to anything before Rubber Soul, except for the hits that everybody knew, the stuff that was on the red and blue hits albums. And there's good stuff like all the way through. And you just forget oh, I didn't know this was a Beatles song. I knew this was a great song, but I knew, somebody covered this in the 70s or in the 80s.
Nowhere Man is one of my favorite songs.
Yeah. And where is that? I couldn't even tell you what album.
That's on Yellow Submarine.
Yeah. See? And absolute gem, like a top 5. That's a John song, right? So that's a candidate for a top 5 John song, right? In the middle of an album that most people kind of skip.
Mhm.
Yeah. Rebecca,
What
Yeah,
about
the
you,
only movie that
Rebecca?
oh, sorry.
No, you can go first because they're moving us along.
Oh, I was just gonna say the only movie I couldn't get my hands on was the Magical Mystery Tour. It was completely out of print. I couldn't find any copies.
I am thoroughly obsessed with the Magical Mystery Tour's album cover. Like, it makes
little bit
no
of
sense,
Chris
and
out
I'm
there, is
a
there?
huge fan. But no, I am actually a fan of their older stuff. I always have been. I have, in general, always enjoyed like everything that came before Rubber Soul, more so than anything after it. It's just so for me, if I had to pick a favorite album, it would probably be Help, just because it makes me very happy every time I listen to it. But yeah,
Oh, sorry, Nowhere Man is on Rubber Soul. It was in the movie.
Yellow Submarine is like I think there's a few new songs on it, but it's mostly a soundtrack album, so it has like a lot of older things from it.
I just remember it from the movie, so
that is a
to
great
me
song.
it equates to that album, but it's not the same thing.
Man, every time I try to because I always have Wikipedia up and I'm always like scrolling through things, but everything involving the Beatles is just like so much scrolling down the page to get to anything.
Hey, Rebecca, I was going to say, you got to really check out the BBC radio recordings if you like early period Beatles, because it's basically live recordings in a controlled studio environment.
Yeah,
right?
I definitely should. I wanted to do like more research on the Beatles, and then this month got away from me. So it's really just been anything that I could do in the past weekend.
Yeah. That's my go-to Ringo album for people who say Ringo didn't drum on the Beatles records. I say that this is live, it's in a radio studio, and he's even better than he is on the albums. So
yeah, it was Bernard Purdy sitting behind a curtain.
That is way too small.
What's that?
It was Bernard Purdy sitting behind a curtain.
Of course he was.
I actually should have like pulled up the certifications and sales for each of their albums, but I don't know. We always like.
Sorry, you could also just say they sold a shit ton of records and leave it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of Wikipedia, I think they're one of the few bands where every single song they put out has its own Wikipedia page.
Yes.
Very hard to find any band that has that. The Beatles were one of the very few.
Having their Wikipedia page up next to me is not helping me at all, because I have I'm just scrolling constantly and clicking on things constantly to find anything. The Beatles were a phenomenon. Like, I talked to a friend about this a really, really long time ago about like how the Beatles like changed the trajectory of pop music. Like, and not in a way that they liked it, which I understand. Their songwriting is so insanely well crafted, but very simple at its core.
Mm-hmm.
And it created like a lot of music kind of imitating them in that way.
Yeah. You know, one thing I realized in writing the book, and this is more for you, Becca, because it's early period Beatles stuff, is, the girls were always screaming and they would ask them, why are they screaming? And the guys would say, you have no clue. But the screams were the loudest when they were imitating Little Richard. When they would do that screaming, like either like total full out screaming voice or the falsetto voice, when they did that, if you listen to live recordings, the screams from the 12-year-old girls get louder. And Brian Eno brought this up so Brian Eno is young enough to sort of have to remember what happened when the Beatles were. And what he said about them that's easy to forget is anybody doing covers of black R&B, and we'll just keep it simple, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, folks like that. If it was on white radio stations, it was very homogenized.
Yeah.
They took out all the screaming. They took out all the falsettos. It was just smooth, like smooth jazz versus, John Coltrane. And the Beatles were the first white group to get out there and really sing from the gut, like people like Little Richard did, And so I had never put two and two together like that, because Elvis was very much influenced by Black artists, but he was very much also homogenized, especially, after his stint in the army, And so that was like a really, really big deal, that you didn't just have Pat Boone covering Little Richard on the radio. Now you had the Beatles doing Little Richard like as well as they could do it and not holding back. So I think that's part of what they did. And a lot of stuff that's lost is they took as much from what was then R&B, and you can't really understand them without understanding the R&B they were listening to. And again, R&B back then, we're talking about late 50s, early 60s, is very different than what we think of as R&B now. But yeah, they were the first people to black it up, I guess.
Well, with the lighter skin tone.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's well studied in music history how, just the appropriation that happened of Black music and how it wasn't hitting the mainstream until white artists picked it up, and how controversial that is. Like, why did it need to be like that? Well, we know why. But coincidentally, those moments that you're talking about where the girls scream, if you watch the movies, it also happens to be when they do this with their heads.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like,
they're shaking their hair.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And the hair was such a controversy back then. Like, there were so many interviews with them about, like, why do you keep your hair long? And they're like, why do you keep your whatever? Like, they would ask a lot of times I liked watching interviews with them, and it was always hilarious how whenever they were asked a question, instead of answering, they would ask a question back. And it was always like returning it on the interviewer, and it was very funny.
Yeah,
George
they were some of my favorite people to watch give interviews.
Eddie Izzard. There was, I think it's the Ron Howard Live music documentary of the Beatles, where they were interviewing Eddie Izzard, and he was talking about their comedic chops. And it wasn't like they were, stand-up comedians, but they knew how to deal with hecklers really, really well. And the way Eddie talks about how you deal with hecklers, you say the first thing that comes into your head. So when they were doing, I think it was one of their first press conferences in America, when they came for the Ed Sullivan Show, somebody asked them, when are you getting a haircut? And George said, I got a haircut yesterday. And everybody laughed, right? So it's kind of like this really nasty like thing, like, where are you getting a freaking haircut?
Yeah.
And, and they had this immediate like, how do you deal with the hecklers? Like, I had a haircut yesterday, and he had, right? Which is the funniest thing. But
well, because it was on purpose. Like, that's what a lot of those types of people didn't understand. Like, they were trying to set themselves apart with the mop tops. And it's funny you say that about them being talented comedians without even trying. Like, if you watch the movies, I mean, Help is so funny. Hard Day's Night is really funny. Like, their comedic timing is like tight.
Yeah. Yeah, I had never thought about that. I just thought that was them being, the personalities that they were.
And it is.
But to have Eddie Izzard say, no, these guys have real comedic chops in terms of this is exactly how you deal with hecklers, So
I wonder if that was something that they like built up while they were like performing, like before the Beatles, like when they were just like in clubs every night, just playing constantly, if they just kind of got used to.
Absolutely. What they talk about that from what was this city in Germany, the Hamburg days? They'd have to gig 8 hours a day. And then the German club owners would come in and they didn't know English. And so they would say, Mach Schau, which is make a show, right? And so they were, I think a lot of the madcap stuff came from, we have an hour to fill and we've done all of our material and nobody's left. So what do we do? And then I think that started then. And plus also those four guys really had a great vibe together. So part of it is natural and part of it is being in front of an audience for like hours on end and having to entertain them, right? and having to like, do covers that people call out that you don't really know. And then you mess up the chords and then you make jokes and then you're just zany and stuff. But yeah, I think, that was definitely their 10,000 hours was Hamburg.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about when I realized how dark John Lennon could be was when I was watching Hard Day's Night, because that sense of humor, that snarky sense of humor is definitely already there with him. But what I now realize, having spent more time listening and reading, is with George Harrison, there's an underlying anger that isn't really apparent on the surface. But later, when he feels free to talk, whenever he wants to talk, if you say something stupid, he'll knock you right back down. And I see it, and I think I noticed it during the Get Back movie, where and where he finally leaves. I really got a sense of, because I mean, he was the sunniest songwriter in the band. I think he wrote, and again, not to put down Lennon and McCartney, but there's a different kind of beauty to Harrison's songwriting. He's clearly a romantic in a way that I don't think Lennon and McCartney were, so it's so that anger that he has within him, I think it was more difficult for me to notice before, but I go back and I to the earlier stuff, and you see interviews and stuff, and that anger was already there. He just kind of kept it under wraps in a way that Lennon was always very openly contemptuous about everybody, whereas Harrison just kept his mouth shut.
Yeah. Terry Gilliam said he was both this amazing spiritual and super nice guy, but then there was always this rage underneath that, almost like he needed the spirituality so that the rage wasn't up at the surface all the time.
Sure.
I'm just like waiting, because I feel like if I wait a little bit, then somebody will come in with like a topic, and I am the least like knowledgeable person here, so I'm just like, what is everybody talking about?
Well, I mean, going back to Harrison, I always liked John Lennon's snark. That appealed to me a great deal, and how he always liked to pull the dog's tail. But Harrison, he seems to me, out of all of them, he seems to be the most complex of them all, both in terms of craftsmanship and as a human being. There's so many things about him that did he write an autobiography, Miguel?
I would doubt it. I don't know though. I don't know.
I'll have to find a good biography of him. And
there's a great Martin Scorsese did a great documentary of his that I highly recommend.
Yeah, I never got around to seeing it because I think I dropped Netflix about the time that it was released.
I have it on media DVD. I could loan it to you, Tim.
Oh, aren't you special? I might want to borrow that.
Yeah, it's really good. And he's definitely like one of those flawed people that are amazing. But yeah.
And later in life, the most handsome one.
Well, there you go. I think Ringo was the most complex figure, Tim, so I want to take you to task on that.
I love Ringo. When I was in high school,
complex.
I had the biggest crush on Ringo.
There you go. As one does. He's the drummer, for God's sakes.
I think Ringo
is just so stinking cute.
He seems to be the most zen of them all. He seemed to be the one guy out of all of them who could just like, yeah, whatever. I'm just here to play drums.
No. In terms of their working relationship, if you watch the Get Back documentary, he is always positive and always at the drums waiting for somebody to start something, and he talks about that was his job. Like, I'm always sitting here, anybody starts anything, I'm ready to start up. You know what I mean? And so even though Paul was the taskmaster that would call everybody at home and say, hey, we got to go into the studio and work on something. When they were in the studio, I think Ringo's sort of steadiness of like, let's keep going, let's keep going, let's keep going. When they're all sitting in the studio, was a big help, you know. My 2 cents. Hey, I did want to say one thing about people were saying about they're the only one of the few bands on Wikipedia which every one of their songs has a Wikipedia page, and these guys did not have a whole lot of bad material. I mean, and name any other bands. How many albums did they do? Was it 12 or 13? People who did that many albums and the last one was this good when they're breaking up. I mean, these last 2 albums, the Abbey Road and Let It Be, is a band breaking up, and George quit in the middle of Let It Be, right? And the fact that they could still do really, really good quality stuff. And again, I think Abbey Road is more of an amazing record as opposed to amazing songs, but it's amazing. And the fact that they could do that while they're breaking up and not really getting on, I think is just amazing. And one of the drummers that I recently interviewed for the book, his name is Todd Sucherman. He's the drummer for the band Styx. And I fell in love with him because he had this amazing retort to all these people that come up to you as a drummer and say, the only thing they know about drumming is that Ringo sucks, right? Hey, Ringo sucks, right? And then he says, no, he doesn't suck. And what he talks about is, Ringo drummed on 300 songs. And, if you add it up, it's 300 songs they recorded. All of them have the perfect drum part. And, you go do that. And once you record 300 songs over 8 years with the perfect drum part, then I'll talk to you about how much you think Ringo sucks. But I think as a creative entity from the beginning to the end, and certainly they evolved a ton, but like the quality, there was just no sucky albums, even things you think you can throw away, like, Magical Mystery Tour or Yellow Submarine. You listen to it and there's just like, oh my God, this song's on this album, So I think that's part of their appeal. And the other thing is people like me can go back and listen to stuff and learn something every single time. I was listening to this album today, and I'm figuring stuff out, about the medley. Wait, the medley really start there? What's going on with that? And there's just always stuff. There's amazing depth and quality. And I think that's why they're, as big as they were, and, one of the few bands with a Wikipedia page for every song, which I'm not sure how I feel about that, but that's cool.
Sometimes it just takes you to like a specific statement for it, but I don't know. I always forget just how short of a time frame that they were a band.
Yeah.
Because they released, like 12 albums over the course of 8 years. They were releasing 2 albums a year.
Some years more, yeah. It's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, it's a lot of hard work, and it's always really impressive to me. It kind of just feels like a star that burned really hot and just died really fast. And it's because you can hear like their music changing and like kind of as they gain popularity, and then as they're kind of like sitting in their fame, and then as they're like breaking up, and you can kind of hear that in their music, and it's such a short period of time that it's ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think that the way that they set themselves in the music business, that they had a level of independence that members of other bands don't typically have. And I complain about this all the time about these old bands from the 70s that have no original members and they're still out there touring. When you can control your destiny the way these guys could, they were able to just say, no, the Beatles are done. We're done. Boom. And so there was no carrying on afterwards, releasing subpar material with new members or different members, or even with the same guys. a band like Chicago, which should have broke up with the death of Terry Kath, and maybe before then, because Terry Kath was getting ready to leave when he killed himself on accident. I mean, they were already 2 albums into a very sucky career. I mean, yeah, they made millions, but from an art perspective, the songwriting had just gone way downhill. And then you take an example like Led Zeppelin, which for years Jimmy Page kept trying to get Robert Plant back into the fold to start working again. And Robert Plant created he's like, no, I want to explore this, I want to explore that. He was never afraid to leave the safety of Led Zeppelin. And these guys were not afraid to leave the safety of the Beatles. They could have said, yeah, I'm fucking miserable, but hey, we got a paycheck.
Right.
So I admire them for being, saying, nah, fuck this isn't any fun anymore. I'm going to go do my own shit.
Yeah, well, and I often forget too how short a time period they were together as a band, simply because of the influence that they had on music, rock music, and just the ubiquitousness. Like the Beatles are everywhere still to this day. Like it's insane to think they were only really together for maybe like 6 years.
Yeah.
Here's a question, and directed primarily at Miguel, but to the group as a whole. Would they have turned into the great songwriters that they became if they didn't have George Martin? How much of what they became was part of the way George Martin worked with them?
Well, I think he was definitely an enabler, and he helped them a ton. I mean, him and Paul put together the whole medley on this album. Ringo and John and George had nothing to do with that. And there was things he could help them realize that they maybe couldn't do themselves. But every time he showed them something, that they jumped on it, and then they went beyond that. And they were pushing him too. So I think it was a real symbiotic relationship that both sides were, growing from.
Mhm.
I think I mean, not to leave George out of it, but I think the main thing was that you had a band with 3 lead singers, and and two and well, at least at the beginning, 2 of the greatest songwriters on the planet, right? And that John and Paul were sort of pushing each other to be better. Just like they had that rivalry with the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys would do Pet Sounds, and then the Beatles did, Sgt. Pepper in reaction to that. I think John and Paul were sort of inspiring. Like, John would come in with "In My Life," and Paul would go, geez, I gotta beat that, right? And at the beginning stages, that was healthy, and it became less so later on. But I think that, I'm not answering your question. To go back to your question, I think they needed a vehicle, and the success of the Beatles gave them a vehicle to really spend all their time on songwriting. And the fact that you had 2 guys who were great, that were pushing each other in a band, and that worked for a good long while, probably into and through Pepper. I think it's why they became as good as they were. Did I answer your question, Tim?
Sort of.
We'll
Yeah.
let Beckett and Rebecca finish answering.
No, I think it's
all I
honestly
got.
just how condensed their time was spent. Like they spent so much time songwriting. Like I almost think that it was just almost a side product of that, more so than anything else. Their influences on each other definitely did push everything.
When I was asking that question, I was just thinking in terms more of arranging the songs and how they were eventually orchestrated, for lack of a better word. And I don't mean that in terms of having an orchestra. I just mean the way that it feels like he took. They all sculpted the raw material, but it feels to me like oftentimes George Martin was really the one who was sculpting the material into its final form.
I think that was more true at the beginning, and then once they got good at it, they would push him. I mean, but one of the things you can see from the Get Back documentary is that George isn't really as involved as he was earlier, right? And he had been, I mean, he kind of had been replaced by Glenn Johns, sort of, right? So,
But he had already taught them everything he could, maybe.
well, yeah. I don't know about that, but I do think it was. I don't know if, and maybe I didn't choose the right turn in using the word symbiotic, but I think,
Symbiotic's perfect.
yeah. So George Martin would have an idea, and then Paul and John would go, yeah, we're going to do that. And now we have this idea. You do that, right? Like, what's the song where it was in two different keys, and they just told them to mash them together, right? And that's an example of them saying, oh, yeah, you have ideas here. We got this idea. These two versions, mash them together. Well, they're in two different keys. Figure it out. You can figure it out. We're going to go have a smoke. So, yeah, I think they all made each other better.
Mhm.
We are coming up on an hour here, so I do want to make sure that we wrap up the discussion or talk about anything that anybody has outstanding on their mind. Also, I started this when the sun was up shining through this window, and I am fast losing light. So before I descend into the darkness, does anyone have any final thoughts?
No, thank you for having this, picking this album, picking this band. We didn't get to talk about Ringo much. He's not a bad drummer.
I've
We'll
heard
have
that
to have
somewhere.
another discussion.
I
Okay.
agree that I think he's the most positive Beatle. Like his stage presence is so glowing and sunny. He's always so happy.
Because he always stood outside of all the crap, it seems, most of the time.
Well, it feels like he was, unlike the other three, able to separate himself from the pressure a bit because he wasn't one of the key songwriters, maybe. I don't know what.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is that. He wasn't being competitive and trying to get one of his songs on a record, you know?
Yeah.
By the way,
got
there's
one.
a great scene in Get Back of George literally writing the bridge to Octopus's Garden, like in real time. Like Ringo has the verse, beep, 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 and George goes, oh, you know what you can do with that? Bang and bang and bang and bang and done. There you go. There's your bridge. But yeah.
I love that bridge. It's great.
Yeah, it was really inspired. Well, this talk in general, I really need to go and just watch all the movies as well.
They're really good.
Yeah. It was another thing that was on my list that kind of got pushed to the wayside. I kind of intended to do like all of my study of the Beatles over the course of the month, and then it suddenly was like the Saturday before the call.
Fair.
But
Don't ask me how far I am in the Werner Herzog book.
I haven't started.
How far are you into the Werner Herzog book?
I thought you were listening to the audio.
I am.
Oh.
Not very far.
You have a month left.
Long.
Does he narrate the audiobook himself?
He does.
But I love it. Anyway, that I'll save it for that discussion.
You can join us next month for that discussion. But with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. And I hope that you enjoyed listening to this album as much as I did. And I hope that you enjoy listening to the next pick as well.
Which is?
You'll find out on the first.
Yeah. All right. Good night, guys.
Good night.